Today is March the 31st, 2014, and this afternoon we're here at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, and we're going to record a video oral history of two of the founders of Linear Technology Corporation, and try to get some understanding into how this quite extraordinary company managed to achieve what it has done over the last 30 years. The gentleman with me today is on my left is Robert Dobkin, also known as Dobby, and is the Vice President of Technology Engineering. What is the title?
Chief Technical Officer.
Chief Technical Officer, there we go. And on my right is Robert Swanson, better known to everybody as Bob Swanson. Bob is founder and the chairman of the board of Linear Technology.
Executive chairman.
Executive chairman of the board, and no longer has the CEO title.
No longer has the CEO title.
We can go through this process as we get into it. I'd like to start off with just try to get a bit of background on each of you and how you found your way into this area of the industry, and how that led to the founding of Linear Technology. So Bob Swanson, could you give a little background in terms of your family, where you were born, where you were educated, and what your interests were in those years?
Yeah, so I grew up in a little town called Wilmington, Massachusetts, which is about 18 miles north of Boston. College days for me were during the Sputnik crisis, when everybody was encouraging you to be an engineer to catch up with the Russians. So I went off to school, first to a two-year technical school, because I actually wanted to be a pilot. Nobody in my family went to college, and I didn't get any pressure to go, but I recognized that to be a pilot, you had to have at least 2 years of college. I like math and I like science, so I went to a two-year technical school, and that was called Wentworth Institute of Technology, which is still very well known. And when I finished that, I took the test to go in the Navy, and there wasn't a slot for pilot training until December, and this was May. It's a long story, but my parents had bought me a new car, but I had to make the payments on it. And so in order to wait till December, I had to go get a job. And I stumbled onto this company called Transitron Electronics, which made transistors and diodes. Now, I actually had a degree in industrial engineering, but I knew what a transistor was, which was a big deal in 1960. And I had a one-semester class in transistor physics and circuits. So I went in there and interviewed, stood in line with all the operators, and when they saw I had a background in statistics, they hired me on the spot. And so that's where I started my career.
And about what year would that have been?
1960.
1960.
Yeah.
And Transitron was quite a leader in the industry in those days, I understand.
Transitron, at $60 million a year in sales, was the second biggest chip company in the world back in 1960. Second only to TI, and people ask me, well, how big was TI? And I can't recall, but they certainly went $1 billion. I'm guessing they were maybe 150 million.
Sure.
So the entire market for chips were in diodes and transistors had to be less than $500 million in 1960.
And so what did you do at Transitron?
Well, as I said earlier, I wasn't a double E, but I understood statistics. And Transitron had just won a major contract with Lockheed to build a transistor for the Polaris missile program. And this was the beginning of statistical process control. And they had part of the requirement in the book from Lockheed was that you had to do a chi-square test. Now that's about as fundamental in statistics as Ohm's law is in engineering. Nobody knew what a chi-square test was. Not David Bacala, not Leo Bacala, not Nick DeWolf, the future founder of Teradyne. And so I said, yeah, I know what that is. And they said, you hired. And I had actually gotten another job offer at Polaroid. And if you grew up in Boston, Polaroid was like the place to work.
Sure.
But the guy who would be my boss was on vacation, and so I couldn't report for 2 weeks. Well, again, 2 weeks. I needed pay for 2 weeks. So I accepted the job, and they told me that, and I told them what was going on. And they said, well, look, come work for us for a couple of weeks. If what you do here is not interesting, then go work for Polaroid. Well, I stayed for 2 weeks. I stayed for 3 months. I gave up the idea of going to the Navy. And the first project I worked on was a PNP transistor it's a germanium transistor for the Polaris missile program. And again, my first job was basically to look at all the data on the development line for every run that was built and do test of significance and so forth and so on. That only took maybe a couple of hours, maybe even less than that. So they said, why don't we teach you how to actually make the measurements? So I'd sit down at 575 curve traces and other homemade equipment, and I'd take the data. And even that didn't take more than 4 hours a day. So they said, come on out on the line. We're going to show you how we make these things. And so anyway, the long-winded answer to your question, but when that product was getting ready to go to production, they offered me the job as the production engineer, because by this time I knew as much about how it was built as anybody.
Sure. Yeah. Interesting beginning. Not planned at all.
Not planned at all.
But a wonderful base on which to build.
So that automobile that my parents bought me that I had to make payments on probably saved my life, because I didn't go in the Navy and didn't wind up on some hillside in North Vietnam.
That's for sure. That's a great story, Bob. Dobby, tell me a little about your background. How did you get interested in the area and develop some skills?
I always liked electronics. I liked electronics as a kid. I started by taking things apart, and then I learned how to put them back together again. And I did electronic projects, so I knew something about it. I went off to school in Boston to MIT, and I was not a good student. I wanted to do electronics, so I spent a lot of time in the library and not doing my homework, so I didn't do very well there.
What did you go to study at MIT if it wasn't?
I thought I'd keep electronics as a hobby, and I went to study metallurgy.
Oh, I see. Interesting.
Which actually has been very useful over the years.
Yeah.
And after 2 years, I dropped out, went back to Philadelphia, and got a job at GE Reentry Systems. And I was in the test equipment division, where we'd make test equipment for satellite pieces. And I found GE had a great calibration lab, and back then all the equipment all had manuals with schematics and circuits in it. So I continued to study how circuits worked over that time period. I stayed there for about I guess it was about 1.5 years doing test equipment, which last time I went back was still in use. And I got recruited to work for a company up in Boston called Philbrick Nexus.
Sure.
And they made modular op amps, which is a little epoxy block with a few transistors in it that was an op amp, which is a very popular structure for doing circuits. And the person who hired me in was Bob Pease. Okay, who's well known now in the industry. I don't know how well known he was there, but he's somewhat of a character, but very bright, very good at engineering. And I worked at Philbrick Nexus for a year. I was supposed to develop ICs for them, but there was so much, they were part of Teledyne, there was so much infighting between the different sections of the corporation that we couldn't get anything done. It was just horrible. So I got an offer from Bob Weidler at National Semiconductor. Okay. He's another well-known IC expert. Sure. Well, back then, there was only one person who was really well-known for doing analog ICs. That was Bob Weidler. And that was in 1969.
Okay, so you moved out to National in 69?
Yes.
Okay.
I wrote to Weidler a couple of times, and he called me up and said, if you think you can do better than me, come on out here and show me. So I went out to National Semiconductor, and he retired about a year later, and I took over his group.
Okay.
So that's how I ended up in the semiconductor industry at a company that could really make semiconductors.
That's interesting. Neither of you went into the business intending to get into the semiconductor. Well, there really wasn't a semiconductor industry in those
Not the
days,
same.
as we know it today.
Well, as it turns out, we
Fragmented.
were quite lucky that we fell into it at the beginning of an industry that turned out to be so significant.
Right.
But at the time, it was people were still talking about tubes and other electronic devices, yeah.
And they were making things out of discrete transistors. It took Weidler and National Semiconductor to teach the world that you could make high-performance analog in chips.
Sure.
And after a couple of years there, the highest performance analog circuits were in chips. So after that, people stopped trying to do it out of discretes and worked in the chips.
Sure. So how did you get into analog? You went
Well,
from transitron to
yeah,
Fairchild.
there was a long period. So in 1961, transitron experienced the first recession in the chip business. Their sales fell from 60 to 38 million. The place was in turmoil. Backlot Brothers really didn't know how to manage in that kind of crisis. They treated engineers like they were a commodity. You probably know the story that they hired a group of engineers from England, a group from France, a group from the Netherlands, and they thought that was an endless supply. They would go over, hire them at European wages, bring them over, and so in the long and short of it was morale went to hell in a handbasket. And most of the senior people that I worked with, like Lamond and Wolf Corrigan and so forth, who were smarter than me, they left early. But I hung out until 1963, when it was pretty clear to me even that the business, this company had no great future. Mm-hmm. And luckily I got a call from somebody at Fairchild, where a lot of other people had preceded me from Transitron. In fact, the San Rafael factory in the early 60s was referred to as Transitron West.
And that was San Rafael, California,
San Rafael, California. So anyway, I went to work for them and learned that, and my job at Transitron was basically a quality kind of job, trying to make the product better and more reliable. And the way to do that usually was adding steps. When I got to Fairchild, they explained to me, this is a business. So we want you to make the product better, but we want you to make it better with less steps, not more. So I learned one of the first big lessons there. So I worked there for about 4.5 years in various jobs. I think my first job was section head in quality control engineering. And then I wanted to be a plant manager, so Fred Bialik, who I'm sure you know that name, said, well, you don't know anything about running a factory, and a good place to start would be production control. So I went in production control as a planner. I used my math skills, and pretty soon I was showing them how to predict availability 12 weeks out, which they thought was amazing. I became production control manager. And then my last job there is I went back into operations, and I ran one of their two groups. One was called standard diodes, and one was called advanced diodes. And I ran that group until I finally left to join National, which is something I wanted to do immediately when all those companies were born in '57. But because of an agreement between Fairchild...
You said 57, you meant 67.
67, excuse me, 67. Between Fairchild and National, they agreed not to hire any more people. So I waited a year and then joined Fred Bialik in Danbury, Connecticut. So I worked at National for 14 years. I worked in Danbury to straighten out this mess that they had back there. Got promoted. I wanted to do a good job so I could get back to California. I lived in Tiburon. I went from Tiburon, California to a place called Danbury, Connecticut. Right. Now, I'm laughing because most people think that Danbury, Connecticut is this beautiful place, and it's not bad, but it wasn't Tiburon. So I worked real hard to get back to the West Coast, and I did a good job. Instead, they offered me a job to go to Scotland to run a factory, to set up a factory, set up another factory in Germany. In those days, there were two marketplaces, EFTA and the Common Market. And you probably know that EFTA, the biggest country there was the UK, yeah. And the Scandinavian countries. Anyway, make a long and short of it, I stayed there, and there's a lot of jobs that I did, but basically I set up the business for National, wound up running both factories, and then I think in 1971 moved from Scotland to Germany, back to Scotland to build their first wafer fab, which is still in Greenock, Scotland right now. And so after about 8 years, I actually came back to the U.S. and I was given the job to run the analog group. And I think I told you previously that I hardly knew an op-amp from a voltage regulator. I had no idea why Pia wanted me to run this group. And frankly, I didn't know if it was condolences or congratulations running this group. It was the flagship group. They made these really hot products, but some weeks they couldn't make them, some weeks they could. Had a bunch of very talented prima donnas, including guys like Dobkin. And so anyway, it turned out to be interesting experience. And so it was 1973 when I was given the job of running analog.
And that was all of National's analog.
That was all of Analog's National, all of it, yeah.
And that business then was?
Business then, I think
big?
I think at 73 it probably was in excess of 100 million in sales. And there were actually three groups: advanced linear group that Bob ran, a standard linear group where products got to be more mature, and a consumer linear group, products aimed at the consumer business, which is things like audio amplifiers. And the way this thing worked is that Bob's group would generate these new products, and then you would move them into the standard group some years later. And basically what that meant is we'd be willing to accept a lower margin on the standard group, and the consumer made no margin. One of the early lessons I learned. When I left in 1981 to start Linear, it was a $250 million company.
Okay.
And I think I also told you earlier that at the time, about 1981, not only were we the best in terms of technology, whenever they did a survey, customers were asked, who do you think of when you think of linear or analog integrated circuits to buy from? National was number one, PMI was number two, ADI was number three, and National and Motorola were number 3 or 4 or 5, I can't remember. Mm-hmm. But National's score was bigger than the next three guys combined.
Okay.
That's the kind of brand recognition they had.
Sure.
Because of the kind of products that guys like Bob made. But in 1979, Charlie Spork bragged at one of these exempt dinners about 1979, we also could say we were the biggest in analog, biggest U.S. company. Mm-hmm. I think we just passed Motorola at the time.
When I was at National, with Weidler starting, I learned a lot besides just doing the circuits. Mm-hmm. Okay, it was important how to pick them. It was important how to test them, and how to present them to the customers, because it wasn't by accident that National was the biggest. We presented the products. We backed up how it worked with lots of literature, lots of applications. And when a customer needed a part, he'd go to National because the parts he got worked.
Easy analog, essentially, solving problems for him. Now, there's another aspect that was important that I thought you were going to talk about, but that was good, was the synergy between process and design engineering in analog. It's very much more important, I think, than in some portions of digital.
It's important because if you don't do the process right, you can end up with parts that are unreliable, don't meet spec. There's all the intangible items on analog products like noise, stability, and if you don't get the process right, you start interfering with those. Right. And the product may meet the spec on a high-speed tester, but when it gets in the customer circuit, you get complaints.
Yeah, even as the technical flyweight in the team, I observed that the analog engineers, the good ones, understood the silicon.
Right.
Understood the silicon very, very well. Yeah.
And did the silicon people understand the circuits? Did they have to?
Not necessarily.
No.
It was
up to the designer to really get into the depths of the silicon and then help tweak the process.
It was designer-centric. A lot of power products, the designer has to understand the circuits. Plus, you can have this chip where one side of the chip is 50 degrees hotter than the other side, and there are components that have to match to better than 1/10 of a degree for it to work right. Mm-hmm. So it's a matter of the physics, it's a matter of the assembly, it's a matter of understanding how to lay it out to make it work right.
And this was all learned on the job, because you certainly didn't learn it in college.
There was never any courses that went that far.
How do you go figuring out a process like that? What's the approach to the challenge?
Sometimes it's trial and error, but most of the time you know the problems that you're going to run into, and you think around them as you're doing it to get the part to work right.
You know, my observation was that, and kind of a joke, is that the 10-year designer was better than the 5-year designer because he had made more mistakes. So I think one must have been trial and error. Right. And as long as he was good enough not to make that mistake again, he was now anointed senior designer.
Yeah, I've said that too. The older the analog designer, the better, because he's learned many years of mistakes not to make.
Until you start approaching Alzheimer's or something.
Yeah. But that was the really So I had a lot of eureka moments, and one of them was how you can't sit down at a computer and design one of these circuits. You can't simulate it and so forth. So there was a lot of work done in layout, working with the silicon to get it right.
And a lot of measurements, because there's a lot of things that are not well characterized, especially back then.
Okay.
So you want to make something, but you have to go test some transistors and some ICs first to see what you can find out to put in the new one.
Now,
And
would you be doing your own layouts as well?
we had
Did you say
people
that-
that were specialists in layouts,
Right.
but the design engineer hoovered over the layout every day, looking at different pieces. If he didn't look at it several times a day, he wasn't doing his job.
And so during this time then, you were running the design group for the advanced linear, oh, is that right?
Yeah, this is while I was doing,
This is at National.
this is at National.
How many designers did you have at that point?
I had in my
roughly?
group, I had 4 designers,
Okay.
including Bob Pease at one time.
Wow.
Yeah, so the organization was pretty interesting.
Yes.
When you think way back then, a $200 million business, 250, we had 3 different groups, as I said before. Each group had its own operations manager and its own design manager. And then a product manager ran the whole thing. And he had tests and everything. Each of these groups had their own wafer fab. The only thing that was kind of shared was the sales force and assembly. So it was like they really taught us, maybe they didn't mean to, how to run a business.
Right.
It was, and as part of that group, you had to get involved with anything that went wrong, okay? It all came back down to, all right, this part doesn't work right, who does it go to? You go to the design guys who have to decide, is it the process? Is it the circuit design? Is it some other unknown problem showing up?
So during this time, Bob, you had the fab areas reporting, all of the fab areas
Yep.
reporting to you? 3 by the sound of it.
3 of
wasn't
them,
it?
yeah.
3, and each of those had a fab manager, a process engineering
Yeah.
team,
Yeah.
sustaining engineering.
Right. So the product manager, he was called the product line manager for each of these groups, had a fab manager, and he had a design manager, and then reports. The fab manager, actually, he wasn't more than a fab manager. Test and product engineering, everybody reported to him other than design. And he was called the what do we call him? The operation manager. Yeah.
Yeah, he was
Yeah.
product line manager.
Product line manager. Yeah.
And so how where was your focus in terms of running the business? Was it new product design and definition? Was it manufacturing? Was it custom? So there are so many things.
Well, my
you have to
background
do
was
as well.
manufacturing, so
Yes,
you know,
okay.
I tried to contribute in that area. But I had this eureka moment, maybe a year into the job, a year and a half into the job, when the 2 lines that generated all of National sales then was the T-Squared, the digital business, and the analog business. And I think if I did 250 million in sales, a guy named Jim Sma, who ran the digital group, you know Jim, maybe they did 350. And in absolute dollars, analog made a little bit more dollars in sales. Our margin was much higher. And I remember Jim's job, he was making gates and flip-flops like everybody else. As far as I could tell, there was no difference between them. And his job was to figure out how to whittle away at cost to stay in the game.
Yeah.
And I realized what the linear guys were doing, they were designing, you know, better op amps. They were designing better regulators. They were designing brand new functions. And cost was just something you did a double check on, but they were creating value at the top line. You know, an extra quarter, an extra $1 for the same piece of silicon because it does something. You know, I like this model way better. And so that was the day I realized if I started a company, it was going to be an analog company because by this time I felt I knew it.
Sure.
And the second thing is if I ever do it, it's going to look like advanced linear.
And we were trying to make products that just pushed the state of the art, that people would buy. And it's frustrating in analog that you can come out with a great product and it still takes 3 years before you get appreciable sales.
Yep. Just the whole design process you have to go through.
The process of getting the customer to design it in and buy it. So,
and for him to sell his equipment.
yes.
I remember one of the hot shot devices that that National was making in Advanced Limited with the LM108, which
Yeah.
is super beta amplifier. And I don't know, we probably sold the mill grade for $50 and the commercial grade for several dollars. But this was a product that some weeks they made them and some weeks they couldn't make them for various reasons. So,
And how do you go about solving a problem like that?
well, you obviously it becomes a focus. So I think what I contributed is sort of this notion that, okay, well, some weeks we can make them, some weeks we can't. That's the business. It was like, no, we need to figure out how to make them every week. And so we did. And, obviously the problems got solved. But this whole thing about these advanced circuits of being so fidgety that some weeks you can make them, some weeks you can't, I think maybe that's what Pierre had in mind when he put me that I would try to bring some of that discipline to it.
Statistical.
Because I certainly didn't. I
Yeah,
certainly
sure.
didn't give him any design tricks or any design solutions.
That was at that time, it took a full redesign of the circuit while we were still in production, of course, and a redesign of the process.
Yeah.
And then it ran like a hose.
Yeah,
So you
I
built.
probably got some credit for that.
So you've taken this business from $100 million to $250 million.
Yeah.
You're making lots of money.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you change?
Well, I heard, I think it was Bob Noyce who answered the question this way: frustration finally overcame loyalty. This was a time when this was the dawn of the digital revolution, and while Charlie Spork and senior management were very happy bragging about the analog business being the number one business, clearly, as far as they were concerned, the future was in digital. And analog was kind of a cash cow, something to brag about, something to depend on to generate cash. But everything about strategy, it was dominated by, we're going to be in the MOS business, we're going to make memory, we're going to make microprocessors. And frankly, we were frustrated about that. But probably the real frustration came from the fact that the company started to get big. It started to embrace the thing called matrix management, which really meant that everybody was in charge of everything and nobody was responsible. And so it got to be very difficult for me to run this flagship line to get things done. I found myself spending half my day arguing with other people who, over turf wars and things like that, and became very political and very, very bureaucratic. And there's lots of stories Bob and I could tell, but one day I had a deal that just broke the camel's back. I said to Bob, who we shared cubicles from us together, and he asked me why I was frustrated, and I told him, and he said, all right. I said, we ought to start our own company.
Okay.
That's the day it happened.
Okay.
Yeah.
It was frustrating from an engineering level. Okay, we have to make masks to make ICs. The mask group, which was internal to National then, just had a huge queue of digital things. We couldn't get R1 mask in. We found a way around it. You buy a bottle of wine and you give it to the guy who's running the line. Your mask goes right through.
I mean, service groups, it was never explained to service groups that you're here to service the guys that make the money. Yeah. We had situations where, Charlie said everybody had a P&L, which is kind of a nice notion when you think about it at first glance. So guys in Singapore or guys in Malaysia who are building linear devices and gates and these little black things called dips, okay? They would decide one day that, analog, why does analog have this coating over the die? Digital doesn't have it. The gates and flip-flops don't have it. So one day our yields went to zero. And we found out they removed it from the process. Yeah. And when we argued with them, it was like, why the digital guys can make their circuits work without this? Why you should figure out how to do it.
Sure. Okay, so there's this level of frustration finally gets to the point.
And it kept going up.
Yeah,
it kept going up.
And so one of you said we should start a company.
Yeah.
So where did you go from there?
Well, I think what happened was over that cubicle that day, Bob and I decided before that if we're going to start a company, and there were some really other brilliant guys, like Jim Solomon ran the Standard Linear Group. You probably know Jim, brilliant guy. But it was like, if we're going to start a company, Bob Dobkin's the kind of guy that could design things that we can sell quickly, okay? And they'll be uniquely different than, doing digital recognition chips or whatever. So we talked about it, and we realized we needed more than two of us, so we exposed the idea to Brian Hollins. Now, he was his counterpart running a factory. He was a really good fab guy, test guy, whatever. he was in. And then we said, and then I guess he talked to Weidler, and Weidler decided for himself he should be in.
At that time, Weidler was not working full-time. He was
Consultant.
he was retired and contracting the sale of circuits to National to do on an individual basis.
So there were 4 of us, and we said, well, we need someone in sales and marketing. So we asked a guy named Brent Welling, who was the advanced linear marketing guy, because marketing worked for the product groups too. Actually, they worked to report it to me, and there was one for each of these 3 groups that we described. And he had just been moved to microprocessors because he was a very, very good guy. We asked him, would he be interested in coming to work for us back in analog? We're going to start a company. He said yes. Anyway, this went on for 3 months.
And this was what year?
This was 1981.
1981. Okay.
1981.
Yeah.
This was the spring of '81.
Okay.
I'll tell you that because it took us 3 or 4 months to have the courage to actually do this. We, the 5 of us would go and drink beer and shoot pool in my house in Saratoga, and
discuss things.
Yeah, and discuss things. And so Bob was going to design circuits, Brian was going to make them, Brent was going to sell them, and my job was to get the money. And so I had lots of meetings with venture capitalists, and this was a very scary time because a company called Seek was sued by Intel.
Yep.
And he not only sued them, he sued all the venture capitalists. So all of a sudden, the Kleiner Perkins of the world, at least they were getting a little touchy about being sued. They were being accused of basically raiding Silicon Valley companies to start their own companies. So anyway, we one day after about 3 months of talking this thing through, we couldn't write a plan. I'd already talked to a lawyer, and we knew it was going to hit the fan when we left.
I see. So you didn't want to write the plan while you were still an employee.
We were told not to write one. So I knew a lawyer at Wilson Sonsini. I talked to him. He gave us some advice, all the things you couldn't do, and pretty much we couldn't do anything. Don't have any meetings during business times. Don't write anything down. And I said, well, that kind of presents a challenge. So I got to go raise some money for some guys in Sand Hill Road. I've never met any of them, and I can tell them what we do. He said, just tell them verbally. I mean, that's going to be a handicap. Anyway, the long and the short of it is that after playing pool and drinking beer for about 3 months, Brent Welling one night said, hey, Bob, are we going to actually start a company, or are we just going to drink beer and shoot pool? And that kind of shook me, and it was like, I was the vice president. I was making good money. I had 2 kids getting ready to go to college. I was the youngest vice president national, but I was frustrated. And like I usually do when I'm impetuous, I jump off the bridge and hope there's warm water below. Anyway, so that's basically how it began.
Sure.
And so we basically got funding from 4 venture capitalists, very well known. This was the days when good deals were shared. That ended shortly after. We had Hembert and Quist, we had Mayfield. Mayfield brought in Sequoia, Don Valentine's company, who I was afraid to go to for fear that he would rat on me.
That's right, because he was close to the official.
And then Hembert and Quist brought in Kleiner Perkins, and they were the 4. And then after we did our deal, and I'll come up for air here, 2 other people wanted in, Sutter Hill and Technology Venture Investors. I didn't know at the time, but they're all really, really well known.
Right.
And after a very short period of time, I realized that what a significant thing it is for Lineage to say we got all these people.
Yeah, you had the cream of the crop there.
We had the cream of the crop, yeah.
Sure,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. How did you feel about this?
Well,
Bobby?
I wasn't quite so worried because I already knew that I could get a job if it didn't work out.
Right. I was the one. They tried very hard to separate us. I was the one that was going to be out of work.
And yeah, they separated. They really tried at National to separate us, to give us individual perks to stay. None of them made any sense.
I had my fingers and toes crossed. I knew what was going on.
Right.
Yeah, there was no way I was going to stay. There was no plus to it. And even when I was leaving, Pierre kind of intimated he would like to be part of the company.
Well, he did more than that.
Yeah.
I don't know if he can do. It turns out that John Finch was my direct boss at that time.
Yes,
Spork was in Asia, and Lamont was the most senior guy. So Lamont tried to talk us all out of it. And I remember I didn't get the feeling that he was trying that hard. And so anyway, they walked us out on a Thursday. I think we handed a resignation on a Tuesday, and they walked us out, kept working on you guys. I was told by Valentine to get out of town.
Okay.
That's a good story. Get out of town because it's going to hit the fan. I don't want you talking to the press or anybody like that.
Right.
It's just going to infuriate the situation. So I get ready to go to Hawaii, and on Monday morning. On Sunday night, I got a call from Brian Hollins saying, "Hey, Pierre just called me." I said, "What's that about?" He said, he might be interested in joining us. And so Brian met with him Sunday night, one-on-one, and called me and said, "Yeah, he'd like to be the CEO." Well, wait a minute.
No way.
I'm going to be the CEO, okay? And so anyway, and then I think Pierre did talk. He called me and said, "Look, I think I can help you." And I look, I'm getting out of here. I've worked with him for years, and I liked him, and he was very good to me. But I want to try to do this my way.
I understand.
I'm 42 years old, okay? I'm kind of an old guy to start a company. And working for you will just be like working at National. I want to try this on my own. The good news was that all the founders said, "We want to do this with Bob."
Sure.
And
Good for you.
but he's a pretty senior dude at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now,
And then he went on to Sequoia eventually.
Then he went to Sequoia. Yeah.
Right, sure.
and at that time, in the years preceding that, I've had offers from other startups to go start a company or go. And you know, when you start a company, it's a team.
Yep.
All right, and we had a team when we started Linear that I trusted. Okay, I didn't have to worry about the process. I didn't have to worry about running the company. I just had to worry about being able to make products and get them sold. Other companies, I would have had to worry about that. And I had no experience working for Pierre. I'd been working for Bob. I wanted to work for Bob. We had a working relationship.
Yeah, so I have here a copy of Don Heffler's newsletter.
You do, yeah. Hey, so you asked to...
Somewhere buried down here,
yeah.
and he was onto you pretty fast, right?
He was onto us fast. So I got to
Key
tell you...
Linear Group quits National.
Yeah. Here's the original business plan, okay?
Okay.
And some of those are in here. But one of the kind of the cutes, or what's so cute at the time, as I told you, Don said, "Get out of town and stay out of town,
Right.
okay? Don't talk to anybody." So I go to Hawaii to lay low, and next thing you know, I get a call from Don about 3 days later, and he's yelling at me on the phone. And he wanted to be on the board, but he wasn't, okay? But he was just like a board member, and he's saying, "You know what your guys did last night?" I said, "No, I have no idea. I'm in Hawaii, like you told me." And he said, "They had an interview with Business Week, and Dobkin said, 'I just want to get rich like everybody else.'" and I was like, "Oh no, how could you guys do this to me?" So we don't have any money yet. You know, we have no money, and so I thought, well, if Don pulls out,
Right.
we might have a problem because he's well respected.
Yep.
As being probably the only guy in the venture capital team that understood the business.
Right.
And but obviously it all worked out. But that was the first "oh no" moment. Yeah.
So how much did you raise?
We raised. We decided we needed $15 million, which turns out to be a pretty good number. And so we negotiated with Hambert and Quist and Mayfield. And I'm pretty conservative, so I sort of wanted to get my hands on the $15 million. And that was a lot of money, but when you think about it in today's terms, a wafer fab, a whole team,
Yes.
design and so forth, that was pretty interesting. And it turned out we did our numbers pretty well. And I had a conversation with Don Valentine, and he explained to me, he said, "There's this thing called stage financing." I said, "What's that mean?" He said, "Well, you don't have to take all the money up front." I don't know about that. Maybe I should get the money up front. And I said, "Well," he said, "No, you could get $5 million up front at $1, say, and then you could do some stuff later and get the other 5 at 3, and maybe the last 5 at 5.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what do you have to do to go from 1 to 3? He said, put a team together. I went, "That's all? We can do that." "What do you have to do to get the last finance?" He said, "Well, have a couple of circuits and build a fab." I said, "Well, that's what we do every day." So we did stage finance. So we raised $4.5 million.
So the first tranche was 4.5. Right?
Yeah, well, it was 5, but the founders had to put up $500,000. Okay,
Yeah.
None of us had $500,000, so we signed an IOU, and so we did $4.5 million, and then I had to go get somebody to build a factory for me for $7 million. They had a tank farm and a wafer fab that was $2 million beyond, any real estate deal if we crashed. I didn't understand why some of them wanted stock options, just like the venture capitalists, and we didn't want to do that. And anyway, the long and the short of it is that people like Perry and Arriaga told us to get lost. Subrato said, I'll build your factory, but you got to give me stock just like the venture capitalists, which when I think about it now was quite reasonable of them.
Right.
Anyway, a guy named Joe Callahan from Callahan Pence, because of personal connections with the venture capitalists, he built us a factory on his nickel without a one share of stock. Then I had to get $10 million to put equipment in this factory. And somebody said, there's this thing called a lease line. I said, okay, so now these guys are designing circuits. I'm out trying to be a CFO. I have no CFO. And so the deal was that I needed $10 million, and I went to every bank with my business plan. I said, I heard about you guys, a heck of a power group. They said, we'll lend you the $10 million, but you got to collateralize it with 10. Well, I don't have 4.5. And that's to pay salaries and stuff. And so I basically went to about 20 different banks, and they all told me the same thing. Great company, guys got a great future, but
Where's the collateral?
But it's 1 for 1. So just as I was suffering from despair, the guy, Glenn Mueller, who was the Mayfield guy, really great guy, just like he introduced me to Joe Callahan, the developer, he introduced me to a guy named Bob D. from Greyhound Financial. I didn't even know there was a Greyhound Financial. I didn't realize they were bigger than the bus company, but that was their business. I went to see him, he came to see me, saw the business plan, met the team, and said, I'll give you the $10 million with only a $2 million collateral deposit. I went, oh, that's a whole lot better, but I don't have that $2 million either. And he said, I'll tell you what, I'll buy $2 million worth of your stock at $3 a share. This took place like 5 or 6 months after our first round.
Okay.
So here it was, our second round at $3 a share. Bob D. from Greyhound is going to buy $2 million worth of stock to give me the $2 million to the collateral deposit. As it turns out, I went and got a very famous Hong Kong Chinese company to give me a letter of credit for the $2 million for some warrants at 5, so I could free up the $2 million to spend it also.
Had to learn a lot in a short time.
Yeah, in fact, I kid our CFO that I was the CFO for the first 12 months because we didn't need a CFO.
Sure.
And I tell him I made better deals on lease lines and so forth and so on. Yeah. And then we did another round just before we went public at $5 a share. It's called the Mezzanine Round. That looked like a regular kind of like private offering. Lots of people buying, same people who would buy our stock in the IPO bought at $5. And that was a $5 million deal, and I was learning lots of things. That we went out to Europe, to Scotland, to every place, and did our business plan. Everybody said it's too expensive, but we want to buy more of it. And I still didn't understand a lot of this. And so by the time we get back to Boston was going to be the last. Started in California. Boston was the last stop. I talked to a fellow at H&Q, and I was feeling a little depressed because everybody was telling me it's too expensive. They were telling him, why can't they buy more?
And this was the mezzanine round now?
It was the mezzanine round, $5 round. And so we got to Boston. This guy, Mike McCaffrey, who you may know, a brilliant guy, said, Bob, it's going great. This is a private offering. We want to get $5 million. There's already $13 million circled. And I said, what does that mean, circled? He said, they're committed $13 million. I went, whoa, we were looking for 5. So he said, look, we can't raise the price in a private round. The cosmetics would be good if we cut people back to $8 million, so you get 50% more than you're asking for, and you cut back. He said, that'll have the right cosmetics. I go, oh, okay. All of a sudden I had $8 million. And so if you add it all up, it was like $17 million. We broke even from a cash point of view with a full fab and a bunch of products at $15.5 million.
Wow. Great story.
Yeah.
So, sorry, do you?
Our beginning philosophy on products was we had to make products that would differentiate us in the marketplace. We ought to have something in our products that were appealing to the customers. Well, to get business quickly, we started off doing second sourcing, but they weren't exact second sourcing. Whatever the prime parameters were of the parts, we added trimming to everything we made, which was different from other semiconductor companies, so that the products that we made were right on the tightest specs that you could get
By
in the
adding
industry.
trimming, you mean you were trimming the components on the wafer?
We were trimming the components on the
to
wafer.
get more precision in the design.
Yes,
Yeah.
to improve the precision compared to the standard products that were out there.
Mm-hmm.
So there are sockets out there where people were using parts, and they probably had to trim up the system. They put our parts in, they didn't have to go through any trim system
Okay.
of their own. So we were able to make parts that work like the original ones, but better. And along the way, we aimed our fab to making highly reliable parts. We'd burn in our parts at 150 degrees C. After we've qualified them, we continued to burn in parts at 150 for a year to see what kind of failure rates we had. They were extremely low.
But you didn't burn in parts that you were shipping?
Not when we're
This
shipping.
was just test
This is
batches.
just to
Unless they were
qualify.
mill grade, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, military grade parts got a burn in.
Yeah, so that was an important part of our strategy, and so one of the side stories was that, as I told you, Intel started suing the venture capitalists, and we met all the venture caps, including Perkins, and he said, "You guys are going to get sued." Said, "You guys just forget that second source strategy, which of course was going to bring us income early, and just do proprietary stuff." And I explained to him, well, instead of having sales in, a year and a half, 2 years, it might take 3 or 4.
Right.
He said, "No problem, we'll just give you more money now." I already understood the state's financing part. And I went, no, I don't think I want to do that. So anyway, but he said, "You guys are going to get sued," which of course we did by National. In fact, we were sued for 7 years, the first 7 years of our existence. But that was a critical decision to do second source products, help the existing suppliers.
Right.
We clearly helped them service the market that they created
Sure.
with better products. And then, of course, I would say within 3 or 4 years, the vast majority of our sales were sole source,
Sure.
unique products from us. But that first $6-7 million a quarter came from better 117s, better 108s.
Right. A little bit like what AMD did in digital with
Exactly.
the 83 for
Yeah.
free. Try to add
Exactly.
something to make it appealing to a
Exactly.
customer that doesn't know. So you
But we-
started the company. Sorry.
But we structured the company so that all the new products had trimming.
Right.
All the test systems had built-in trimming capability, which was not inherent in the test systems at the time. So that when we had the products that needed to be trimmed,
Sure.
we could set it up for trimming everything.
I remember you did something else that at the time I didn't fully appreciate, but a lot of data sheets were unclear as to whether this parameter is tested at temperature, and Bob insisted that we're gonna put a red dot on all those parameters that are tested over temperature.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing we did is, in the analog area, that's almost impossible to actually capture all possible applications of analog circuits, every corner. You do all the obvious ones and so forth and so on. Well, one of the things that Linear did is anytime there was a application, a typical application, Bob made sure guys actually breadboarded it and made sure it worked. It wasn't just on paper. You do this you do this typical application and use these component values, it's going to work just like we say.
Yeah.
It's the theory of minimum phone calls. You make 1 million parts, and unless they all work right, you get 1 million phone calls.
But I mean, after 5, 6, 7, 8 years, all of a sudden this kind of idea, this kind of strategy, pretty soon people were talking about, you get the best data sheets, you got the best app notes, and you got the most credible data sheets. When we look at your data sheet, we can believe your characteristic curves. We know you actually plotted them, they're real. And after 5, 6, 7, 8 years, you realize how important that is.
Sure. People trust the next product that comes
Exactly.
out and stay with you as long as they could. So you started the company. Did you build the very first wafers, or did you have those fabbed outside somewhere for you?
That's a good story too.
Well, we had, when we first started, we got a small place that was good for engineering and for offices. And as soon as we had the money, we started building our wafer fab.
Mm-hmm.
And our first wafer fab was over in Milpitas. And it actually got done 14 months after we started.
Mm-hmm.
We got our first wafer out. But meanwhile, you're making all these mask sets. They're
Right.
changed. You need to see if they're going to work. There was a company that was making ICs down in Florida called MCE.
I remember the guy Otto Hibby.
Yes.
I forget the name of his company.
He's a guy that talked very fast. But he had a wafer fab, so we paid for him to make wafers so we could check out our parts. We tried his wafers, we tried his parts. We were not happy with the reliability. We just used his parts to do experiments and debug our parts, never for any production. But we got our parts out of our fab. We had mass sets that were clean, ready to go into production. We had the test systems ready. We were ready to go ahead.
Now, in 1981, there were no foundries, no bipolar foundries, and I'm guessing 95% of the sales. By the way, the market was $2 billion total in 1981, and now it's like 45. And I'd say 95% of that was bipolar. Lots of special bipolar. The only people who had a fab like we needed was National and ADI and PMI, and they weren't going to help us. So we had to have our own fab. This what was kind of a godsend in a way that we ran into this guy. A lot of people called us, and Otto Hibby called us, and I didn't know before. And he offered his fab. He had processes, super beta processes, supposedly, and so forth. We were actually going to launch the company on his fab because it was up and running, and that was part of our original plan. But stuff started failing. And life test, and we looked at it and figured out why, and we said we could spend a lot of time fixing his fab, but that put us back maybe a full quarter until our fab was up and running.
Okay, and Brian Hollins, I guess, was the responsible for building the fab and bringing it up. You said 14 months after you'd started, you had your first wafers come in.
I have. The first wafer is still on my desk, and it was presented to me in December of 1982. Yeah, so that's like, and it. By the way, it wasn't passivated, but it was patterned, and so that was a Christmas present. So that was about 15 months. Yeah. Right.
So how did Brent go about selling this new company stuff that nobody knew? What was his reps, I presume, or did you have direct sales?
Yeah. People? So we started out, looking for stocking reps, and And I think maybe I can't remember exactly the time frame because Brent didn't last very long with us. We had a West Coast sales manager, an East Coast sales manager, some stocking reps around the countryside in every city, and also we made a terrible mistake of giving Arrow exclusivity, and that was a terrible mistake because it was nonsense for a company with 6, 7 products to give exclusivity to Arrow. Top management saw the future, a good future, but it was years off, and so, pretty soon our aggravation level at the sales level exceeded any good rewards, and so they fired us then. Interesting, they were our exclusive distributor again. But it was a group of stocking reps.
Right.
Yeah.
And was there a big training challenge there?
Yeah, there was. And again, I think what happened was we had products that had to be sold on some kind of feature, something better than what's out there. And stocking reps who were selling 9 different lines, the days of dropping off a data sheet and a sample, we quickly realized that didn't work. And but anyway, we had no choice. We couldn't afford our own sales force. I would say we got to maybe 150 million before we had our first direct sales force.
Really?
Now, we went from 2 guys to 4 guys to 6 area managers and so forth, but no direct salespeople per se.
Okay, they were all managing reps.
All managers, yeah.
We had field application engineers, and we had those pretty early. And they would go into customers and actually help the customer design.
Got it. And who did they report to?
They reported to sales.
To
sales
sales.
management, yeah.
Okay.
So I think back of like our first sales manager in Taiwan, our first sales manager in France. They were FAEs that worked for one of our distributors.
Right.
Yeah, and so it was very much a technical. Even in those days, on our products today are like 50 times more complicated, 10 or 15 times more integrated. But even then, we had to go find. Okay, we've got a product that has a composite screw better than Maxims or ADIs. Okay, they have some things better. We have some things better. Our sales guy had to find an application where the things that we do better meant something. And that's all we were looking for. So you had to know our products better than the average salesman needed to know his product.
Which is a challenge when you're working with a rep, who probably, the better job he does, the bigger he makes in sales, the sooner he loses the line.
And that's exactly right. The reps knew, first of all, I mean, working on a project that would be 3 years out, we didn't even want to do that, but
Right.
you know, we had to allocate some time to do that. They weren't interested in doing that, and you're right. And they had this fear: by the time we get to be $20 or $30 million worth of their business, it's time for us to go direct, which is exactly what happened.
Yep.
Back in the early days too, we didn't have a lot of applications people. The design engineering group did the applications of all their parts, and they went out to visit customers. And the customers liked being able to talk to the guy who actually designed the part. And the guys from the factory liked talking to the customers. They could see the problems and see what to do for a better part next time.
Sure.
Yeah,
We
so-
had seminars too.
Yeah, so that's another unique thing. First of all, everybody at the company the first 3 or 4 years was a salesman. And since technical sales was so important, the designers spent a lot of their time before the product was finished, after the product was finished, checking to see, did we hit the bullseye, didn't we? Does the next product have to have something different? But what I recognized is that, you know, they see it, a customer sees 4 or 5 of us sit from sales, and then he starts to get introduced over a period of a year to all these gurus. And pretty soon I could see them saying, geez, you got a lot of really smart people working for your company. And so the more they went out, the better impression they made on this little company called Linear Technology.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. So how big was the design group over the first couple of years, Bob? You and Bob Weiler and a couple others, maybe?
No, 8 people, 9 people, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. I would say by the time we went public, you probably had 12.5 designers.
Yeah, I probably had.
Yeah.
And how many years was that? So
Oh, we have about 275, 270. Those are circuit designers,
Yeah.
surrounded by teams of
right.
support people.
No, I'm sorry, but you went public after what
We
year?
went public in 1986. May
86.
of
So
86, yeah.
so in 5 years, you'd got about 12 designers.
Oh, we might have had
20.
maybe
20.
a couple
Okay.
dozen by then.
And this was the time when you had this Gurus campaign. You had some.
The gurus actually
Pretty-
started
yeah.
earlier.
Before that, yeah.
Yeah, the gurus, back when we first started, we wanted to start getting known. We didn't have a lot to sell, so we started selling the engineers. And we came out with the first ad that was the gurus ad.
These are 5 of your key designers, including yourself
Yeah.
on there, Bob. and,
Yeah, 5, including myself.
And for the sake of people who are going to see this in the future, who are these gurus? Can you give me their names?
Sure, this is me. I think I look a little different now. Carl Nelson, George Erdy, Bob Weidler, and Tom Redfern.
Where did they come from?
They came
National and PMI.
national media, yeah, and Bob Weidler was independent at the time.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
And
these-
they were known in the industry for products they had previously made.
I would say for the first 10 years, Linear's persona wasn't the house that Bob Swanson built. Well, that's the company Jim Wieners worked for. That's the company that Dobkin works for. Yeah.
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Now Jim had not joined the company. At
No,
that
Jim
time?
joined later. He was
Later.
applications.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And how did you hire these people? Did they come knocking on your door, or did you have to go sell them on why they should move?
They came knocking on our door.
Okay.
When I came back from that trip from Hawaii, that Valentine, scared the heck out of me. Like, maybe I've blown it. You guys had this interview with Business Week, which is the typical, a hit piece that they do.
Of course.
I got home and I must have had 50 or 60 voicemails on my telephone. There were all kinds of people that work for us at National, really good people, all wanted to come join us. And it was like, I don't care anymore that Valentine's mad at me. Yeah. So now George Erdy is a great story. I was at a national sales meeting, and some of the sales guys were complaining about we need to put out more new products and and so forth. And I was saying, come on, we got the 2 best designers were Weidler and Dobkin. What are you talking about? And he said, well, there's a guy over at PMI who some people would disagree. Maybe you got the best designers. What's that guy's name? It's George Erdy. I didn't think anything of it. A year later, when we started Linear, before we raised the money, just when it was announced, one of these advanced pieces, I got a call from George Erdy. Had I not heard the story of the salesman, I would have probably blown him off. I didn't know who he was.
Yeah.
You guys all know who he was, but
Right.
I didn't. But it was like, oh, okay, this is the beginning of, look, I could tell that 4 or 5 really good, well-known designers in analog was the difference between a company with success and a company that might not make it. So we worked hard to get him on board.
Okay.
Yeah.
And he was very productive, and he came out with a lot of very good selling
Yeah.
early circuits.
These were not all prima donnas. You have a
They
manager.
were all
yeah,
talented.
we're all-
They were all
we're all
prima donnas.
So how do you manage them?
They all, except for Weidler, they all wanted to make a great company because they knew that that's what their reward would come from. There was really no trouble managing them. There was, okay, what are we going to make next? It was really very easy. In terms of what I did, I'd go look at everybody's circuit. They didn't mind me looking over their shoulder if I saw mistakes or problems or had suggestions. Got incorporated into the circuit came out better. There was no problem. Weidler was working for himself.
It was easier for him than it was for me. You know, I was the guy that was counting money, and we were getting close to running out of it.
Yeah,
so.
you must have been paying these guys pretty well.
Well, they weren't. None of them were overpaid. They all took pay cuts to join us, but I mean, they were expenses. I mean,
Sure.
you know, when this company started, we had this great business plan. We spent exactly like we said. The only thing that didn't happen on time was sales. And so, you know, there was one period of time when, just before we did that third round of financing, where I had $1.8 million in the bank, and we were going through, I think, $300,000 or $400,000 a week. And I went, no, it wasn't that much. It was like maybe $150,000, $200,000 a week. And I went, whoa, that doesn't win to 1.8 million very many times.
Right.
I already had in the back of my head that when you decide you need money, even if you're a very good company, you might take 6 months to actually see the check. So that's when I scrambled to go out and get the money. People took pay cuts and did other things to get in. As luck would have, as soon as we got the money, our sales jumped to $1 million a quarter. All of a sudden, we broke even. But
That was all planned, of course.
yeah, but I mean, I'm saying these guys were all really good engineers, all committed to the company. But sometimes I had to explain to them why I couldn't buy that extra oscilloscope they wanted.
Sure.
One of the nice things about analog, the products we made back then when we started, they're all for sale now, and they still sell in volume.
How did you choose the products? What was the decision process you went through? One of these guys come up and say, I want to build one of these. Was there a justification process you had to go through?
Not early on.
Not early on. It was mostly talk about a product. Is this a good idea? What kind of features do we want to put in? It's all talking over the water cooler or next to each other and come up with it. Okay, we ought to go make one of those. And we went and made it.
I mean, we knew the sockets because a lot of those sockets we created at National, and these guys knew how to make them better. We started the company. You know, there's 50 companies out there in the chip business. Digital is the wave of the future. Analog is last year's technology. How are we going to compete? And you know, we got together and said, look, we need to do something better than everybody else. Anybody know what we can do better than everybody else? And the answer was, yeah, we know how to make even better precision op amps than even PMI can make or ADI. We can make better voltage regulators than National, who's the leader. So let's start there. And our goal was so we could say, these are the best products. Nobody else can make them as good as we can. They have the best specs, so forth and so on. But as time went on, we realized we had to spread this specialist kind of reputation to make all analog products, because here's this finite, small, relatively small analog market, and we're starting out with a little piece of it, and on top of that, we're saying it's only high performance analog we do. So we had to spread. We had to be a mile wide, you know, and a foot deep, and that was the strategy how we did this.
And which markets were most of your customers in? Was this military?
Well, in the beginning, you know, we were pretty flexible at moving from market to market. But this was the early 80s during the Reagan days, and military was a buildup. And what we discovered early on was that the military didn't care if you were a startup. As a matter of fact, they liked the idea of startups because the big companies were preoccupied serving the commercial business. they felt like every time there was a boom business, they didn't get any support from anybody.
Yeah.
So we sold them, look, we need customers. We can make these products. We had to do a lot of organizational and process kinds of structures so that we could satisfy Mil 883 and S11 and all those things. But we found the military customers to be very receptive to us. We gave them a lot of attention they weren't getting from the big guys. And so when we were $100 million, $40 million of that was military. That was our biggest market segment. And then we moved to the industrial, then we moved to the PC era, we moved to the communication area, and now in the automotive industrial area.
How well did you think about moving? Did you drift into these areas, or did you say, hey,
Some
I
of-
don't go after the communications?
Some of
or
them
something?
were strategic.
Okay.
Like early on, strategically, we said analog circuits are going down from plus or minus 15 volts to 5 volts. Let's make sure everything we make works on 5 volts, which was a good decision.
So there was CMOS was part of this then?
CMOS came later,
Okay.
but there's a lot of things you can do with CMOS you can't do with bipolar.
Right.
We needed CMOS, so we put CMOS in.
There were a lot of fads. There were a lot, everything from, microprocessors are going to do things that eliminate the need for analog. Then DSP machines came along, and then the digital guys by this time, made things called ASICs, and they were gonna put analog on with the digital chips and put us out of business. And every time the investor community heard about this, it was Panicsville for them. So we had to spend hours and hours and days convincing them, what VLSI and what LSI Logic are going to add for analog is that cheap stuff that we never did and aren't doing, and the stuff that we do they can't do.
Yeah.
But you have to tell them 10 times before they finally start believing you.
There were companies that said they're going to make analog ASIC, who are no longer around.
Yeah.
But at the time they got money, somebody believed them.
But you asked about the process. We've told the story about linear many times, and there's some secret sauce things that we do, and one of them is every Wednesday afternoon, most every Wednesday afternoon at 3 o'clock, designers present a product for approval. Now they may have been working on it for months and getting all their I's dotted and T's crossed, and we have now 14 design centers around the world. So it doesn't matter whether it gets called in, okay? And in this meeting is usually myself. When I was CEO, I'm still now the CEO, the CTO, test engineers, other designers, process people. And the designer has to put up his product and say, this is what this product is, this is what it does, this is the market it's after. These are the features that are going to make it better and going to make it worth this, and this is what I think it's going to cost. And basically people take shots at it and so forth and so on, and what markets it's going to aim at. Nobody would think we're going to build a product for a consumer anymore.
We talk about what we think that product's going to sell for.
Yeah, what that product's going to sell for.
So it fits into our product line.
Now you have quite a formalized process.
So it's very formalized. And then it gets approved. Now, in the old days, it used to be 5 quarters later, 7 quarters. Now it's like sometimes 20 quarters later.
Before you start to see some...
Before the product is RPL, before it's
yes.
finished, because
Yeah.
they're getting so complicated.
Yeah.
So we're making 5 and 7 year bets now. So basically, this product that was introduced, at a Wednesday meeting, 4 years later, now we have another institutional meeting called, it happens every Friday morning at 10 o'clock, and it's a pricing meeting. And this is where a product marketing engineer does this detailed analysis of this product that was launched 1, 2, 3, 4 years ago. And we look at the assumptions. Is there any competition that now didn't exist then? The things that we were shooting for that made it a better product, does that still exist? Is that still true? Has the market changed? Is the thing still worth what we thought it was worth? And there's a detailed analysis of this product versus competition, why it's different, why it's better. It's called a product pricing strategy summary. And it gets into a document that goes to everybody in the field. That's another important part of how we have institutionalized this innovation process.
Right, so you evolved into this as you
Yeah.
realized it was
Yeah.
necessary to have more control over Bob's designers deciding to do something over the
Well,
water
in the
cooler.
beginning, it was verbally,
Right.
look, we don't sell our products based on some multiple costs. We're making products, And our first cultural thing was, what is this product worth? I know what it costs, but what is it worth? Don't just mark the cost up 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. What is it worth? Oh, well, I think it's worth $2. Why is it worth $2? Because it replaces something worth 3. Okay, good. Okay, so that's how we started. That's part of the culture of the company. Yeah.
In terms of culture, there's obviously something you've developed over the years, and hiring is a very important part of how you build a culture that works. What was the hiring process in designers, Bob? After you've got your gurus, there are so many gurus you could hire. You had to hire people and train them.
When the gurus all had 15, 20 years experience, and they knew what products would sell in their areas. Then we started hiring people who weren't gurus, because we needed a lot more people. Right. They'd work with one of the more experienced people to pick products. How did we pick them? We knew they had to be able to design. We came up with a bunch of questions, and everybody had their own favorites that we gave them, and they had to solve circuit problems on the board or come up with answers on the board, or we had to see how they could think on their feet. And that was one piece of it. The other piece of it, we had to look at how we thought they'd fit in. Okay, one of the things that we don't have is we don't have small kingdoms within Linear. And even now, we don't have small kingdoms. We picked people who wanted to work for the company to be successful. That was a big part of it.
Mm-hmm. I think you heard about this book that was written, The Company Nobody Leaves. And I think the guy did a good job at capturing, we have a culture that's not bureaucratic, it's not political, it's an engineering-driven culture. So engineers come to Linear, well, first they come to Linear, they stay, but even new guys come, and right away we realize this is the place where engineers are given lots of freedom and lots of respect, no bureaucracy, or little or no bureaucracy, little or no politics, and it's kind of an environment where all we care about is what are you working on, and did you solve the problem? Yeah.
And when is it going to get done? But it's really, we had our board into a meeting at Linear, and they were introduced to some of the engineers, and the engineers would stand up and give their name and say how long they've been at Linear. And they're talking 15, 18 years, 20 years. The board was impressed with how long people stayed at Linear.
These are the people that work under the general managers. Mm-hmm. These are kind of the senior engineering section heads that pull together everything that's happening in these 14 design centers. Because this Milpitas is still home base, comes in here, and every time I do this, something like this, the board says, "Well, I have a lot of smart people, Bob," and I get credit for that. So, but it was I was impressed. Not even I was impressed, but they'd get up and they'd say, I went to Caltech, I went to MIT, I went to Virginia Tech, went to Berkeley, went to Stanford, got a master's, got a PhD. I got out of school 14 years ago from MIT with a PhD, and I've worked at Linear for 14 years. I went to Virginia Tech, I have a PhD, I've been out of school for 12 years, and I've worked for Linear for 12 years. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's
impressive.
Yeah, it really is, yeah.
So these 14 design centers, where are they? How many in the U.S., how many overseas?
I think all but 2 are in the U.S. and as
3, we got China.
Oh yeah, China, that's right. So we have China, Singapore, and Munich. Mm-hmm. But our first design center is I think, a good story how Linear. We have our first design center in Boston. You might think, well, that's because ADI is there, and that's not a bad reason, but that wasn't the reason it was there. We had a guy named Sam Knock who was a really, really good engineer. He was a product engineer, kind of a senior product engineer. And he was married to a young lady who was also an engineer. They both came from ADI to the West Coast. She worked at National, he worked at Linear. And one day he informed me that he's going home, going back to Boston. That's where we're going to have children. The wife wants to raise children in New England. I'm from Boston, I understood that, but I hated to leave him. Well, we don't need a product engineer in Boston, but we were talking about a design center, and I asked Bob, "Hey, do you think Sam could be a design manager?" And he said, "Yeah, I think he could be." So we set up a design center. Sam Knock set it up. Mm-hmm. He wasn't a designer before. He runs a design center now with over 100 designers.
Wow.
Yeah. And then we have one in Vermont. We have one in New Hampshire. We have one in North Carolina. We have one in Phoenix, one in Dallas, one in Santa Barbara, one in Grass Valley. We'll go any place. We'll go to the moon. If we can find 6 or 7 really good analog guys.
So this is driven by where the people are rather than your-
absolutely, yeah.
How do you manage all these design centers? These report to you?
No, they don't. We have one manager that runs all the design centers.
Okay.
But again, the groups of people that join the design center are still the type of people that want to work in an environment where they can do engineering, they don't have politics, they're respected for what they do, and they come join Linear. You just have to give them a project, and you don't have to do a lot of managing after that.
I think we've done, I've actually bragged about, I think we've done this remote design center thing very well. So they're like a resource to the general managers. And while there's one senior guy who all the design center managers report to, the working designers, they get their assignments from the GMs. So some of them are involved what we call D power, some involved with S power, some just work for mixed signal. So basically they take their product directions from the group, but all the administrative work and the reviews and so forth, and the person that the design center manager reports to is this central remote design center manager. But so they're very, very much tied into taking direction and working on projects that the GMs have decided is part of their strategic goal.
A lot of the people in the remote design centers spend a lot of time back in Milpitas working with the engineers here. And as far as culture goes, cultures are very similar because we have the same culture. People don't leave the design centers either.
Yeah. So we've done that very well. You know, in the early days when people would say, hey, you guys in your 40s are going to be old someday. What are you doing to back it up? And we'll worry about that later. After about 10 years, we realized we couldn't hire as many designers that we could afford and needed in Silicon Valley. Wow, everybody doesn't want to live in Silicon Valley. And so we started to go where there were pools of analog talent, and we realized, 5 or 6 good guys, okay, who can attract another 5 or 6 good guys, that's enough people to justify a design center. That's a lot of critical mass in analog. We've done that, and we haven't lost control of it. We also visit these design centers every quarter with senior people who basically keep the communications really well. Yeah.
Are there any of the markets you got into along the way you decided are not where you wanted to be and you had to back away from them?
Sure.
Yeah. So we actually did an annual report way back showing how we moved from not out of, but moved from military being the biggest to the industrial market being the biggest, to the era of the PC, okay, to the era of communications, the networking, the internet, and automotive. And after the dot-com bubble burst, we got to $1 billion in run rate, and overnight it fell in half, okay? And so we're deeply involved in the PC, involved in the internet. In fact, that was the days when you had to convince people that even though our name isn't linear.com, the nuts and bolts of the internet is the kind of stuff we make, okay? We had a market cap of $23 billion. I mean, it was crazy. We thought it was crazy, but we thought it was going to last forever. Anyway, the long-winded answer to your story is that when our sales fell in half, and we had to do a lot of significant things, even though we still remained healthy, as the world came back up again and sales started to come off that 500 million to 600 to 700, we found ourselves involved in a lot of consumer stuff. The beginning of not smartphones, but featured phones with 2 displays and cameras and stuff like that, and iPods and MP3 players, those kinds of things. And I went, hey, wait a minute, what are we doing in this business? And it was like, somebody tried to convince me, and they did initially, that there's a new consumer era. It's called high-end consumer, which I later decided and confirmed that's an oxymoron. There's no such thing as high-end consumer. Anyway, we got to do about $300 million in this business.
Out of your $1 billion?
Out of our billion, yeah. As we climbed back up to $1 billion By 2005, we were back up to $1 billion, but 30% of it was a business we had never been involved in before. Samsung phones, and MP3 players, digital soul cameras, all that stuff.
This was with products that were designed as general purpose products. Right. We didn't make customs for that. Yeah. It turned out that the products that we
didn't make customs, but we tweak products. We tweak products, and even whether we did or didn't, the really bad thing was all of a sudden we got a third of our business that's dependent on that many customers who want a significant price break, not every year, every quarter, or they're going to throw us out. And you don't have to be very high math trained to realize, after a couple of years, we won't make any money. Right. So we made a decision. They talk about this in this book, and analysts now have figured out that, look, this is a wrong market for us. This they won't pay us for these non-price things like quality, delivery, support. They get all the support they need from everybody. They don't care about our better features. They would much rather buy a first generation product at half the price than a next generation product at 50% more even. And it was just, this was not a good fit for our strategy. And so in 2005, we told people inside the company and Wall Street what we were doing. And of course, everybody in Wall Street thought we'd lost our minds. I mean, how can you grow if you're not in consumer products? They all now understand how dumb that was, okay? Even some people in the company thought, this is crazy. And so we redirected the sales force to take no more business from these companies. Don't spend your time designing anything in there. We told the design team to refocus their efforts on more complicated chips for markets like the industrial and automotive market that need more complex solutions and will pay us for those non-price things like quality, delivery, and technical support. For 4 or 5 years, it was like, is this thing working? Right. And now, I think we're now considered one of the best positioned companies by the Wall Street folks because we did this. But for 3 or 4 years, was this a dumb idea or a good idea?
One of the problems with the consumer products is every year the consumer end product changes. Mm-hmm. So you have to, if you're really heavily involved there, you have to redesign your product for them. So you don't have any longevity, and you got engineers that are being refocused on redoing what they did last year just to keep the same amount of business. It's not good for growth unless you have an infinite amount of engineers making a large number of products because they have double the number of products.
There's little or no margin. The volume's so high, everybody gets seduced into make it up in volume. Right. Okay, but some of these end markets, they have design cycles like every quarter. We're working on projects now that a quick project is 3 years. A more typical one is 4 to 5 years. And then we're aimed at markets like automotive, where it takes another 2 years to get it designed in. Mm-hmm. We're making 5 and 7 year bets now, but I think we're well positioned. And so now it's even more critical that we pick the right products, engage with the right customers. Yeah.
So
back when we started, we actually avoided some of those markets. We avoided going into disk drives. We avoided going into areas where one large company could consume the whole company.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we started this company to kind of be free to do it our way, to try the ideas we had. And when you get 3 customers who control 3/4 of your business, you're not free anymore. You do what they tell you.
Subcontractor, basically.
Yeah, and you eventually go out of business. Okay.
Yeah. How is divisions of the market today? What percentage is U.S., international?
Well, the way we look at our business, we look at 2 ways. We look at where did we create the design. Mm-hmm. That's another thing that we recognize early on. I mean, there's going to be a lot of business created in this geography that's going to wind up being shipped to that geography. And we needed to figure out a way to keep our guys incentivized. We're a pay performance company. We have a field team that can't worry about, I designed something in Santa Clara and it winds up being purchased in Shanghai, because it takes a long time to design in. So we had to come up with pay plans that worked, and we did. So anyway, we look at where business is created and where it's delivered. So 44% of our business today is created in North America. The next biggest is 25% is created in Europe. The next biggest is 16 to 17% is created in Japan. And just to give you, I always thought if we could do 15% in Japan, that's the goal. Now we're doing 16 to 17, so we're over achieving to my goal. And then the balance, I think, is 14 if you add them up, is in the rest of Asia Pacific, with China, of course, being a big piece of that. Now, if you look at where stuff is shipped, only about 29 to 30% winds up shipped to North America.
With the 44% that's created here, yeah.
Yeah, and over 40% gets shipped to Asia Pacific. I think Japan, Europe does 25% created and about 13% gets shipped there. And in Japan, it's like 17 and 13 gets shipped there. See, everybody is outsourcing, but nothing like what North American companies are doing.
Sure. Is that changing at all? And
I think it ought to change.
You see any
I
manufacturing
hear
coming back
rumors
here?
and I hear anecdotal stories about companies who are disappointed in especially those companies that outsource their design, which always seemed weird to me. I hear stories about designers who've designed a product and never saw a factory and vice versa. So I hear all those anecdotal stories. I think maybe it is coming back, but slowly, yeah.
Back when we started, there were no really big, or very few really big contract manufacturers. If we sold a product to Hewlett-Packard, it was manufactured by Hewlett-Packard on their production line. Now, there's the big assembly house contract manufacturers. And I've seen products where we've designed our part in, they end up at a contract manufacturer, gets redesigned by someone there, and our part may get designed out.
Well, that's why we track the business the way I explained to you. So we have to have people in Taiwan, okay, that when a design comes over from Santa Clara or Boston, it used to land over there and then where'd it go, okay? Now we have someone at the other end catching that design and making sure, if it makes sense, that our ICs stay in it. Not because somebody likes one of our competitors better, even though the circuit doesn't work the same.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
You have an interesting stack of books there. There must be a story behind those, Dobby.
Well, all through the years, we wrote application notes. We wrote design notes too, but application notes on our products. We've collected those application notes. I didn't write them. I'm the editor of the book. Most of it was written by Jim Williams. And they're a combination of applications that we've done over the years put into a book form. There's 2 volumes. And then half of the first volume is right now in Japanese, going toward getting the second half done in Japanese.
So this is a good story for a guy like me to understand. Jim designed no ICs. Jim wrote all these design notes and app notes, and people in the field, customers in the field, appreciate what he did in written form every bit as much as the ICs that are a critical part of their equipment.
Back when it comes time to design a circuit, you learn the basics at school. You don't learn the details of how to put it together and how to make sure it works and how to test it in school. You learn that on the job from people more experienced. What we did here is we had circuits that were finished, tested. We gave the circuit, we gave the test procedures, we gave how to debug it when it's not working, so that when people start working with circuits, they got a leg up by looking at these application notes. They're not just sales pieces for our product. They really teach people how to do circuit design. And it's really hard to get that now because things are made out of ICs. You can't see what's inside the IC. You can get the specs. But knowing how to apply it, that takes some experience, and we're giving away that experience here.
So these generate design wins for the company.
They generate
because-
design wins. They help the engineer. If we don't get every design win, that's fine. But we want to be the guy that the engineer looks to first for a solution.
Yeah, so we knew even when we started the company that because of the digital craze and so forth and so on, that more and more customers were being analog challenged. So we knew from the beginning this would be a good angle for us to exploit. And of course, this getting amplified since then. So not only do these help the customer's designer understand what it is he wants to do, but it gives us great recognition as the teacher, as the company that makes it easier for you to use our ICs. Yeah.
We're very conscious of our customers. We want to make sure that things work right for the customer, because if you get a customer upset or it doesn't work for him and he gets in trouble, you'll never see him again. So that's why we take a lot of care with putting the ICs together, supporting the customer and getting his design to work right.
Do you provide little PC board designs and things for them?
Yeah, we
as
do
well?
PC board. Our field application will do the PC boards. We give out PC boards. We give out those designs. We'll fly somebody to the customer to help debug it if we have to.
Some of these demonstration boards, I've seen some as big as half this table, and some of you worked on for several months. No guarantee we're going to win a design. We've designed so many analog sections of a customer's end product, thousands. Yeah.
And that's an important part of
Very important
the
part.
process.
Yeah.
I hear customers tell me all the time, I use your part because I know it's going to work when I put it in.
Yeah, so the other thing about this that I think you need to understand to fully appreciate the value of this is our direction as a company, our strategy was to service the mid to small companies. The big companies, yeah, we serve them too, but everybody serves them. We thought we could develop some real loyalty and some real defensive business if we focused on the small and medium-sized customers, the good times and bad times. And so again, I think at that level, this is very much appreciated.
Sure.
Yeah.
And sometimes those engineers end up at big companies.
Yeah. Yeah. In the big companies, you need a fan.
What are the biggest changes, Bob, that you have seen in the analog business since you founded Linear, and how have you managed to ride those curves?
Yeah, well, fortunately, I've been asked that question before. We just celebrated our 30th anniversary a couple of years ago, and maybe there's several things, but maybe the biggest thing is how much appreciated analog is today versus what it was even leading up to the dot-com bubble, which was more about analog and digital. I heard Gordon Moore say that. But up until the dot-com bubble burst, analog was something that, yeah, I know most equipment needs it and so forth, but it's still kind of like last year's technology. And I think now what more and more people appreciate since the dot-com explosion is that not only is analog here to stay, it may not be the majority of the IC business. In fact, it's a quarter of it or a fifth of it and so forth, but it's an important piece. And it's now Wall Street understands and all customers understand that analog has gone from something that they thought was going to be obsolete to something that is forever, and it's a critical part of moving forward with all kinds of applications that were made possible by digital technology, but you couldn't get the products. All these products required analog to finish the job. I think maybe that's the where I used to spend in the early days, and I'd say for the first maybe 10 years, I'd get a 20-minute spot at all these conferences. The first 10 minutes, I would pitch analog as a market. And then the last 10 minutes, our name is Linear Technology, this is what we do.
But that's not necessary anymore.
Not necessary anymore.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think over time the analog designer has become the specialist in analog. When you think, if you go back 30 years, Okay, analog ICs were just starting. Almost, let's go back a little bit before that, there was no digital. There was very little. Almost everything was done analog. And those engineers have had to move to digital or they've retired. Now the analog comes from the analog IC companies.
Now, there's lots of things that I couldn't have foreseen, applications that weren't in my vocabulary, weren't in his vocabulary either. PoE and what we call power system management, which people called digital power, and all kinds of micro modules and all this telecommunication stuff that we do. Functions that I didn't know what they meant. Some of them I still don't know what they mean.
But the analog business has gotten immensely more complicated.
Very complicated.
Okay, we have products with processors in them. And why is that not digital? Because the analog portion of it is so important to make it work that it's an analog IC. It's not a digital IC. The digital is supporting the analog.
Yeah, we had for many years a tagline on our press releases and so forth, exclusively committed to analog. That's not accurate anymore. I'm not sure, you can correct me, but maybe not a majority, but close to a majority of our ICs now have some digital content, maybe some significant digital content.
I would say about a third of them have have some digital content. And the analog content is a lot more complicated. It's got, where the early circuits might have 100 transistors, it's not unusual to have a couple of thousand transistors in our
We
circuit
now do have integrated solutions on a chip. We just don't make amplifiers and voltage regulators anymore. We make things like called battery monitoring systems. You look at the block diagram and it's like, I can't believe we put all that in one chip and make it all work. It's got A to Ds and DACs and references and memory. It's got places to store faults and so forth and so on. It's a big chip and very complicated.
Does this open opportunities for some of your competitors to get better at analog because they have some of these other pieces now?
Yeah, I think so. And I think in the early days we used to brag, or we used to argue with Maxim who had the real gurus. I mean, there was this campaign, who's got the real gurus, So I think our whole approach at sort of focusing on doing the hard stuff, calling us. So we invented the term high performance analog. And I think people saw this as, this may not be where all the volume is, but it is where all the margin is. It's where longevity is. If you do it right, you can be around for 30 years, 60, maybe more.
And your competitors today are TI still?
Yeah, well, TI
having
certainly.
bought out National.
Yeah.
Who's next?
People ask me who our competitors are. You would have to say TI. They're so big and they're everywhere. Analog devices.
ADI, of course.
ADI, of course.
Maxim still is.
And Maxim. Yeah.
And then Linear will be the next in ranking of revenue?
Yeah, so Linear, it would be, ADI, well, TI would be the biggest, okay, but I mean, and then the guys that I compare us, ADI is more than 2 times our sales, and they're 1.3 or 1.4 times our market cap. Today, Maxim is 2 times our sales, and they're 0.9 our market cap. So you can see Wall Street has figured there's some difference between us and them.
Yeah. Now, Maxim grew by acquisition. Did you ever do any acquisitions along the way?
We did do a small acquisition just recently for not an analog product, but going back to the acquisitions, we looked at companies. The first company we wanted to buy was PMI. We actually wanted to buy PMI. They wanted $60 million in cash. The family did, and we didn't have $60 million in cash. I think we had 40 or 50, but we wanted them because that's where George came from. Part of our early success was in precision amplifiers. We'd already developed a reputation. That was just going to add to it, and so we made the Bournes family, a stock and cash deal that instead of being 60 million was 90, and had they done it, the 90 would have become 300 or 400 million. Okay. But they needed 60 million in cash, and I didn't have it. So ADI bought them.
Okay.
And then we looked at other companies along the way and came to the conclusion that they were all overpriced if they were good. And if they were good, why don't we just hire half a dozen of the good people, which we did. And then a lot of them were for sale for a reason. They weren't worth buying. They were just, and you know, we said to ourselves, we're an analog company. We're specialists. If this is really analog, why don't we just do it? We almost we came close to buying a DSP company when this was the era, maybe 15 years ago, when the people who had DSP, again, tried to convince Wall Street, you can't survive as an analog company if you don't have DSP because they go together. Mm-hmm. And we didn't necessarily buy that and still don't buy it, but hey, maybe there's some synergy. So there was a company that we came close to buying, and they were a startup for sale. And we had the final meeting to decide whether we were going to buy them or not. And I wanted to ask the question, okay, now tell me again, they have products better than Motorola. They have product, because we got to be better. We're going to, better than AT&T and so forth, so on. The guy in the back room said, no, their products aren't good as any of those. And I went, what? And everybody said, oh, yeah, that's right, their products aren't. What the heck are we talking about buying them for? And we didn't.
Interesting.
Yeah. Uh-huh. And so we did recently buy a company called Dust Networks. You probably know. They're a remote sensor network company. When I first looked at it, it was like, wait a minute, it's this huge digital chip and software. What's it got to do with us? Well, what it has to do with us is that it's an industrial application play. A lot of our stuff could be around it and so forth and so on. But it was a small acquisition. We actually took a close look at buying Dallas Semiconductor. Mm-hmm. And we all flew down there and we talked to all of their managers, and every manager, I was asking, okay, now, what are you doing to stay in the game? How are you making your product better? And every one of them had a cost reduction program, which is a big turnoff to me. And so we got on a plane, flew home, and said, no, I'm not buying that company. Mm-hmm. Fortunately, Maxim did.
Maxim did.
Yeah.
Have you got some other goodies up there you think will help us understand the company better?
You heard about the company nobody leaves.
Why didn't you spell it out so the transcriber knows what you were saying?
Okay, so there's a book, which is a recent book. A lot of books have been written about linear success and so forth. What's unique about this is a company that no one leaves. This is an English translation that we did for internal consumption, but it talks about and it was done by Nikkei, okay, who's, you know, it's like the Wall Street Journal,
Japanese newspaper.
They're very well known.
Done in Japan.
Mm-hmm. And so they wanted to write a book on linear, and we gave them a lot of interviews, and they found it surprising that it was a company, an incredible company like Linear, that's their words, that has this unique engineering culture, a company that has attracted really good people who never leave. And it was done in Japanese, and we saw the Japanese version of it, and it talked about our transition out of consumer, and they thought, you know, how courageous that was, and Japanese companies should do that, and Panasonic and Sony ought to take a lesson from Linear, which is kind of fiction, but that's what the book says. But we liked it enough. It was that we translated it in English, and it's for internal consumption. This is the book that also came out, which I like even more.
And the title is Three Rules.
The Three Rules, the how exceptional companies think. Mm-hmm. What I like about this book is that they didn't interview a single person from Linear. They analyzed with a group of analysts from Deloitte. They analyzed several thousand companies in 9 different industries. And they picked a company based on a lot of sophisticated statistical analysis and return on asset, financial stuff. And they picked the companies and they named a miracle worker, a long runner, and an average Joe. And in the semiconductor field, they had, you know, medical field, semiconductor field. In the semiconductor field, they analyzed data from 203 companies. I didn't know there were that many in semiconductors, but there's some categorization that says there are. And we were the only miracle worker. There was a company in Southern California that is a $100 million company, been around for 40 years, sell to the military. They were the long runner. And they compared us specifically to International Rectifier, but they said there were 23 average Joes, one miracle worker. But here's the 3 rules. This is what I really like about the book. And they talk about the 3 rules as kind of like glib stuff. Like the 3 rules are better before cheaper. Now, people have heard me say at Linear that our strategy was to be better before bigger. And the other rule was revenue before costs. They drive profits through price and volume, not thrift. So the way I translate this, the way I like to translate it, here's what I think it means for Linear. They say there's 2 fundamental ways companies can choose to stay in the game. One, they can whittle away at cost, so they can be the cheap price guy and win on price, or you can innovate. And more winners, more miracle workers chose to innovation. I mean, Federal Express, they claim they're an innovator in their business, and Merck and so forth. So it's not, you don't just have to be a technology company per se to use innovation to find your niche. That's rule number 1. Rule number 2, I think, is even more important rule, because many companies can innovate. But the most important rule, if you're going to innovate, you need to position your company in markets with customers who will not only appreciate your innovative product, but they will pay you extra for those non-price things: delivery, quality, reliability, and support. And that's what I think we did dramatically different about 6 years ago.
Which is the time you switched out of consumer.
Switched out of consumer. Now, they give us credit for becoming a miracle worker 10 years before that, when our margins were going crazy and our sales were going crazy during the dot-com bubble. The 3rd rule is there are no other rules. So I particularly like this book because I think, and by the way, the other thing I liked about this book is that our strategy of not wanting to be the biggest, wanting to be the best, and wanting to be healthy enough to be around 20, 30 years later, that's been called the Maverick strategy by people on Wall Street. But what this book shows is in 8 other industries, miracle workers had the same strategy. So I think it's a great book.
It's, I look at Bob as the president of the company, and I look at him setting the business strategy. And I look at other companies, and I see the presidents who get their jollies by having the biggest company. And they just keep reducing prices to the point where they're losing money, but they're getting the orders. It just doesn't make any sense now.
David.
I've been so long in Bob's company that I can't see any other way of doing
business.
it.
So when at 42, and my frustration level was at a peak, I used to go to National and want to get up in the morning and go to work there. If I'd say at least 12 and a half of the 14 years, loved working with the company. It wasn't always easy, but I loved the spirit. And so at 42, quitting a vice president job with decent money and jumping off a bridge, I said, I need to start a company that's going to last for the next 20 years. I need to have a place of employment for the next 20 years. So the strategy is not to go to the moon and then crash. It's to build it nice and steady, and 20 years from now, I figured I had 2 more decades to work, it's been 3, that the company will still be there. So it was that kind of strategy. Being bigger wasn't what I was trying to do.
Right.
Yeah.
If we had gotten paid really well and had been fun to work there, we wouldn't have gotten frustrated at National.
Yeah, I often joke that Charlie Spork wrote a book on Silicon Valley. Maybe it was more about Fairchild, the spin-off.
Yes.
I can't remember. And he came to interview me. And of course, to remind you, they sued us for the first 7 years of our existence. Accused me of stealing everything, including the doorknobs, which was a joke because there were no doors. But it was pretty brutal. And anyway, we buried the hatchet. The lawsuits were over, and he interviewed me for his book. And he wanted to ask me about why I left, and I knew that was going to be a touchy thing, why I left. And of course, I color-coded it. But he wrote in his book about Linear, and he wrote that he was wrong, that National, that went full circle and came back to be only an analog company 20 years later. And even before he knew that, he said, hey, the analog business had more legs and more future than I realized. And he gave Linear credit for being one of the best startups of the 80s. Sure. And so he's probably still watching how we're doing.
And after 30 or so years, you have to be handing off the reins gradually to first chief operating officers, then CEOs. How are you going about that process?
Yeah, I did.
personally?
Well, I handed it off.
Right.
When I turned 65, I decided after 23 years, the team needed a rest for me, amongst other things. I looked at the calendar and I said, I don't have the same energy. A lot of people said, Bob, you still get the same energy. But intellectually, I thought it was time for me to step aside. There were some times I wish I hadn't, but I did. And I stepped aside, but I wanted to stay on. The board wanted me to stay on as executive chairman. I don't think any of us thought it would last this long. I'd stay on for a couple of years and so forth. But one of the first things that happened after I turned the company over is that I realized how deeply involved we were getting into consumer business, and how one of the senior managers of the company, whose title was president then, not the CEO, had set this strategy to drive us more and more into it. He wanted us to basically, if we only had 3 customers, and the name was Samsung and Apple and Nokia, he'd be happy. And it was like, this is not what we started the company to do. I'd already given up the job as CEO, so now I was in a position where I didn't know how much clout I had, and I didn't want to be the CEO again. And so basically, I had to convince the board that I had this idea, and that I think what we're doing is wrong, and they supported me. So then I went to the team and tried to convince them that what we were doing is wrong. The world, the argument the world is changing, what worked before is not going to work now. I said that was all BS. The world is always changing, but some things are constant. We got to find customers who will pay us for what we do special. The majority of the team agreed with me, and so I realized, hey, maybe I need to stick around longer than I first thought. After 25 years, I don't want somebody taking this company and trashing it because of a dumb idea, something they want to put their fingerprints on, that's their thing. And so I've stuck around longer, but I am not the CEO. I haven't been the CEO for 6-7 years now. I've involved myself in strategies. I only pick fights and things that I think are really important. I bite my tongue a lot. I bite my lip a lot. But, the company's still doing well.
One of the things that I really liked about working for Bob is he did business by good business practices, not by ego. And I've seen too many people come into positions and they just want to feed their ego. We said marketing guys want to change our advertising structure. Even though our ads are well recognized and read by customers, they want to make a whole new ad setup because it feeds their ego.
Don't let them do it.
Don't let them. They tried it once, and we made them change it back, and we don't let them do it now.
We all know Regis McKenna.
Sure.
So Regis McKenna was on our board for a while. He's one that actually helped us with the name Linear Technology. The company's first name was Thobs, which Thobs stands for the House of Bob Swanson. I actually kind of like that name, but nobody else did. So we were looking for a name, and we just said, well, you guys are going to be in the linear business. You're going to be why not Linear Technology?
Right.
That'd be great, but that name must be taken.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out it wasn't taken in the U.S. So we took that name. But I remember Regis telling us how much money Apple spent educating people that Apple was a computer company and a personal computer company to boot.
Right.
And how long it took even national to have their ads and app notes recognized when people are flipping through. So I think the dumbest thing we can do now is to modernize it, but if you change it so when you open the book, all of a sudden our ads look totally different, we've blown 30 years.
Yeah. Big investment,
Yeah.
brand recognition.
Right.
On that.
Right.
Well, you've been doing this as long as Mr. Swanson, Dobkin. So, are you still there every day designing
I'm still there every day.
Uh-huh.
See, I don't have a lot of people working for me anymore. Right? At one time, I had the whole engineering team, and instead of doing technical stuff, half the week was hiring, the other half was solving personnel problems, which I don't have now.
Bob is one of these dozen people that fly back to the design centers. They'll take off on a Sunday afternoon, go to Boston, go to Vermont, go to New Hampshire, go to North Carolina, go to Colorado Springs, and then go home.
back
And
Friday night.
And then another week they'll do the other design centers. I've seen him go to these design centers where a guy has been struggling with a problem for 2.5 months, kind of like ego, doesn't want to ask for help, or thinks it's a shame to ask for help, and Bob will say, let me see what you're working on, and solve his problem in 10 minutes. He does that all day long. And I think the wonderful thing is that young designers and senior designers feel comfortable going to him with a problem. And I think some of them are still surprised at how often you solve their problem.
You know, it was really important when I set up the engineering group that the person who works on a product gets the credit for it. We don't have a manager taking credit for the product that one of his employees worked on. So everybody gets to be associated with what they're working on, no matter who helped them or what other sources came in to make the product. And engineers, they have egos too. Mm-hmm. They're proud of what they're doing. You work on an IC for 3-4 years, you gotta put a lot of blood into it. Sure. Okay, you don't want anybody to take it away from you.
Is there one particular product that you're most proud of?
Yeah, the one that took me 30 years to make.
And that was?
It's called the LT3080.
Uh-huh.
I came up with essentially the idea for that product when I first started National, but the technology wasn't there to make it.
And what does the product do?
It's a 3-terminal adjustable regulator that adjusts down to 0. It uses a whole bunch of new things, and you can parallel them. You can adjust it to 0. You can use it as a low dropout. It's getting to be very popular now.
Has a current reference.
Has a current reference.
What was the technology that you needed to do this?
What I really needed back then was I needed a good resistor.
Oh.
Okay.
Well, I thought you'd asked.
And we have it now.
Right.
But the idea I had 30 years ago, or actually 40 years ago.
But think about this. This is
pretty
uniquely analog.
Yes.
This is uniquely analog. 30 years later, he does a brand new function. Happens to be a 3-terminal. Is it 3-terminal? 3-terminal linear voltage regulator.
Yeah.
And it's uniquely different than everything else.
And the fascinating thing is they had the idea 30 years ago, and it's still relevant.
Right. Yeah, linear regulators are very relevant still.
Right.
Yeah.
They're very relevant.
But how do you make a linear regulator that's worth over $1 when people are selling them for 15 cents? Mm-hmm. Got to have something unique about it.
Something magic about it.
Yeah.
Sure.
So I think that maybe I'm proud of that because it took so long to get there.
John, are there any penetrating questions I should have asked you think that are appropriate at this point?
I think you've covered a lot of ground.
We didn't spend a lot of time on numbers and things because you can look those up.
Yes.
What I was trying to get was the
Well,
character
I
of...
think you kind of covered it, but
Yeah.
I think the unique chemistry of Bob and Dobby that's gone on for over 3 decades is pretty interesting. And I think you've talked around it a little bit. Maybe there's some more to say about that.
I think one of the things that we had, there was no infighting. Okay, I didn't want Bob's job. Bob didn't want my job. I didn't want Brian's job when we started. Mm-hmm. We all knew what our jobs were, and we went off and we did those. I hear of infighting in other startups, philosophy differences.
Yeah. So to revisit something that I kind of blew over why I left National. National got to the point where it was so bureaucratic and so political that we were becoming inefficient. I gave you some examples. And I thought my boss should have stomped some of this out instantly before it festered into, and he didn't do it. And so when I came to Linear, I had all of these things that I didn't want to happen. No matrix management, shutdown politics. If I see 2 guys fighting, okay, some people take that, well, these 2 guys are smart, let them fight it out. My attitude is, that's ridiculous, okay? You're wasting time. So I would listen and I'd tell them to shut up and we're going to do it this way. I wish my boss did that at National, even if he told me to shut up. Okay, at least we would have made some progress. But so I think the culture that we've created, and I'd like to think that I didn't design any circuits, I didn't make any wafers, but I've created a culture that is non-political, non-bureaucratic. It's a healthy environment where innovation is possible and innovators want to stay. If there's one thing I can take credit for, I think is that kind of culture. Yeah.
I agree.
And I didn't do it by myself, but again, I've been a good student of what happened at National. I had that eureka moment when innovation is better than whittle away a cost. And I also saw the things that went wrong. I worked for Transitron when it was at the zenith of success. I worked for Fairchild in its glory days. I worked at National in its glory days. And I saw them all, what they did that caused it to fail. And I said, if I can remember not to do those things, maybe we'll last longer than 10 years. We have, yeah.
We're at 30 years and we're still very vigorous as a company. Okay, everybody's still marching in the same direction, trying to get products out, trying to help the customers.
You see any threats on the horizon?
You know, not to sound arrogant, but you see the arrogance or ignorance. No, I don't see any threats if we stay the course and do what we continue to do better. I mean, the threat would be that we did something dumb and lost some of our key people.
Right.
What would be dumb is to get too involved with a couple of big customers that wound up directing our activity rather than us directing it. I think the game, the expression, it would be our game to lose. Right now, we're winning. I think we'd have to do something dumb to lose. I don't see any technology that can obsolete what we do.
Our product base is diverse. We make products that are very diverse. We don't have 50 engineers working on one product. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 people working on it. And if that product doesn't sell well, we still have a lot of other products that will.
Is there an average number of millions of dollars of sales per year per product that you?
It's got a long tail, but
right.
Yeah.
We like products. We won't think of making a product unless we can see it making $1 million a year in a couple of years.
Right.
Yeah, and so we have many $1 million products, many $10 million products, some $50, $60 million products. Okay, those are the scary ones because those are going to become the
targets for others.
The target for others. So you know, on this subject, generally on this subject, so I used to try to explain to Wall Street folks why we were diversified. How can you be diversified? You're an analog company and you're talking about skimming the cream. I say there's still a way for us to have diversity. We have diversity of products. We're making a lot of different products. We're purposely involved in a lot of different markets, and we're purposely involved in a lot of different geographies. So if Asia's down, U.S. is up, so forth and so on. And they said, oh, okay, fine, I get that part. But we actually, it sounds like blasphemy, we actually make sure we don't get too big in any one market area. Now, right now, 60% of our sales, I think, something like that, is in automotive and industrial. And that's okay because industrial in itself is A to Z.
Right.
Automotive is a big area that needs technology and quality. And as long as we can deliver innovation and quality, we can defend our position there.
And the total analog market, including consumer these days, is what?
It's about, I think it's somewhere between 42 and 44 billion.
44 billion.
It was supposed to be 50 billion 3-4 years ago, but
right. The consumer gets knocked about.
You'd be surprised at how little consumer is.
Yeah. And the market you participate in that is how big?
Okay. Here's the good news. So industrial and automotive make up 41 or 42% of the total market. Communications, it makes up about another 25%. Consumer, per se, only represents 7 or 8%. Now, in communications are handsets.
Yes.
They're consumer. Computer is about 20%. I don't know what that adds up to be. But so we are heavily involved in automotive and in industrial. And here's what's good about that, is that in the last 10 years, the analog market went from 20 billion to 40-something billion. The automotive and the industrial piece has doubled in size.
Okay.
So they went from 20% of that 20 billion to 40% of the 40 billion. And we're also involved in communication. We're very heavily involved in the networking part, the base station part, but we're not involved anymore in handsets, which is the lion's share of that communication number. And we're involved in military too.
Sure. Linear Technology is a company in the community. Do you have any foundations or any involvement with the community outside of the corporation?
Well, we're kind of a stealth company, but for years we've been a contributor to women's health issues, like the National Breast Cancer Coalition, which is a Washington-based group. We're very much involved in the American Heart Association, the Harvest Bank, things like that. But we're kind of stealth. We don't stand up and do a lot of bragging about it. But
Sure.
we used to be a good contributor to the San Jose Ballet before it got taken over by new management. So, yeah, we're involved in a lot of those things. Yeah.
We give money to colleges too.
Oh, and colleges, education,
Yeah.
big deal. That's the single biggest deal we do.
Right.
And we get a lot of engineers back too.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. We get engineers that come on a rotation as part of their training.
So intern.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then most of them come back and they work for Linear.
Mhm.
They go back to school and they trade stories, and then we get a line on our booth for interviewing for.
Are you
Yeah.
still involved in
interns.
recruiting?
Not so much now.
Mhm.
I mean, the general managers are that have.
Sure.
But are you asked to interview any of the designs?
Occasionally, when they come out, or if there's engineers being hired now, I'll be asked.
Yeah, if they come into Milpitas, they
Yeah.
ask you to interview them. You still interview FAEs, I think.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
Still. Okay. Anything else you'd like to say before we sign off here?
No, it was
Still
it
interesting.
was fun, and it was actually more comfortable than I thought. Yeah, yeah.
Good. Well, it's a great story,
Yeah.
and thank you very much for
Yeah.
participating. And 200 years from now, someone's going to pull out this tape. I don't know what format it's going to be or what media it's going to be on, but it'll give some people some insight into one of the formidable companies that's grown in Silicon Valley, and we really appreciate you participating.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.